up to me really recently, and she said, "Do you mind if I tell you something?" I was like, "Not at all." She said to me that she'd just been on a student trip, and she'd had to go out in the middle of the night and help a girl from another university because she'd just been raped. The next day she felt still really upset about it. She thought she ought to go and do something about this. So she went to the guy who was in charge of the trip, and she told him, and he said to her, "You must never tell anyone about this. At least 2 students get raped on these trips every season, but you mustn't tell anyone." She came up and told me this because she'd just seen my production of Hurried Steps. If I hadn't been doing that production, I really wouldn't have known what to say to her. It's a play that was commissioned by Amnesty International to launch their Stop Violence Against Women and Girls campaign, and it's based on testimonies and newspaper cuttings. But after the show, we always have a discussion with a panel of local experts in the field of domestic abuse. And it's from them that my education really began. Well, when I started the play, I didn't know anything about the subject. I thought I was directing 8 love stories from all over the world that go wrong. I had no idea of the impact or the resonance that this play and the discussion were going to have on people. And at first, I noticed that wherever we went, the panelists would always say the same thing. They'd always start off by saying, "It is not a woman's fault if she's being abused or if she's been abused." And then they'd say, "Domestic abuse can happen to anyone, anywhere, anytime." And it seems to be those sentences that empower people and unlock stories. And the first time it happened, I have to say, I was really shocked. It was just completely unexpected to me when a woman stood up in an audience and said, "This is absolutely true. Everything you've just heard is absolutely true. I never dreamt that I would find myself in a refuge. I went to university. I held down a really good job. I used to be very confident. But one day, I found myself leaving the house with the children and just the money I had in my pocket. But I escaped. I've had to start a whole new life for myself." But the point of writing the play for Dacia Maraini is to show that violence against women and girls is the same all over the world, as you've just heard. It might be packaged very differently, but the cause and the effect is the same, and it's not the woman's fault. And the panelists would always say that she's covered nearly all the forms that domestic abuse can take in her play. Well, sorry, but I didn't even know that domestic abuse covered different forms. Emotional abuse, psychological abuse, sexual and physical abuse I knew about already, but financial abuse? Honor-based violence and forced marriage in the play, yeah, I knew about those. But I had absolutely no idea that domestic abuse was so prevalent and common in pregnancy in this country. And it's not only boys that have told me their stories. One young man in the audience put up his hand and said, "Thank you so much. I cannot believe I have just seen my own story on stage. You showed me my story." He was talking about a scene where an abusive father holds a gun to his son's head. Only it wasn't a gun that my father held to my head, it was a knife. He held a knife to my head, and everyone should know that this goes on all the time. Everyone should know I thought I was alone. The panelists also quote those statistics that you've just heard from Jan, that from the British UK crime survey, that 1 in 4 women in her lifetime will experience some form of domestic abuse, that every week in England and Wales, 2 women are killed by their partner or ex-partner. Now, I heard recently from one of the panels that in the first week of November in this country, 4 women were killed. Why did I hear this anecdotally? because there are no official statistics kept by the government. Not important enough to them. Well, I've also discovered that the most dangerous time for a woman, the point at which she's most likely to be killed, is when she's at the point of separation or when she's left an abusive partner. So I began to think, okay, maybe this is why so many women will drop charges, go back to an abusive partner, stay in the relationship for months, even years, before they feel it's safe enough to get out. Everywhere I go, people tell me stories. Recently, I have met, in the last few years, 2 people whose close friends were murdered by a partner. A young woman, ordinary young woman, told me that every morning when her stepfather used to go out to work, he'd lock the door, locking her, her mum, and her little brother in the house. And when they heard the key in the evening, they were absolutely terrified because they didn't know if this was going to be another one of those days when he'd step over the threshold and assault her mother again. Well, I figured that it is about 1 in 4 people that I meet and tell about Hurried Steps that will give me their stories. But I hadn't thought that these statistics applied to me personally. And then I began to think about 3 of my very close friends, and I realized I'd never actually identified them as being survivors of domestic abuse, but they are. Each one of them had persuaded me that theirs was a very unique situation, that if it hadn't been for the way that they'd behaved, or if they'd managed the situation completely differently, their otherwise really kind husbands would never have had any reason to physically assault them. They had successfully managed to avoid the label of battered wife. And like one of the characters in Hurried Steps, they'd married really socially adept, very charming, very friendly men, all with really good jobs in the arts. Different art forms. None of these friends knew each other at all. But behind closed doors, the control and the violence had been gradual and progressive. Like the panelists like to say, an abuser will never punch a woman on the first date. He'll always wait until he feels really secure in the relationship before he throws that first blow. It was Sally, my friend. She was a successful musician. And I remember sitting around her kitchen table, and it was her baby's first birthday party. Sally had a black eye. Oh, I look like one of those women, don't I, who've been punched by her husband. We're like, no, come on, of course not. No, but really, I tripped Hish, and we slipped the door frame, showed us the door frame, and we believed her. We also believed that she had such a rare gynecological condition that she kept having to be rushed to hospital. She kept her secret from us 20 years. It was helped, I have to say, because they moved miles away. I now recognize that that is a classic example of an abused woman being isolated from her family and friends. I moved in the same social circle as all these women, and I remember noticing at the time that everybody turned a blind eye to the violence, or much preferring to blame the victim. Men seemed to be completely undented socially, professionally, carried on as normal. I remember having a conversation with 2 people about one of the guys who'd had a restraining order put on him because of his violence, and they blamed the wife for calling the police. So it's no surprise then that all these friends felt too ashamed to tell me their true stories at the time. And I asked one of them recently, I said, why? Why didn't you tell me what was going on? She said she thought no one would believe her. I rang Mary, told her this. She'd fled the UK. She'd been a successful actress before that. A man's home is his castle. I'm like, what? A man's home is his castle. She stood in the centre of London in the mid-80s, dead of night. She had absolutely nothing on under her coat, in a police station. Policeman leant over to her and said, "A man's home is his castle." So she went back to her husband. And he's the guy who assaulted her so violently in her stomach that she miscarried. She's only just told me this story. Hurried Steps seems to bring out these stories from people. It seems to empower them, makes them feel that they're not alone and that it's not their fault. Now, I have to just tell you all here that because of what I've just said, and because of what you've just heard from Jan and the other speakers and what you're going to hear, that it is very likely that 1 in 4 people in this room will feel a story bubbling up from them. It's very likely that everybody else, if they talk about things that they've heard today, wherever they go, they will begin to hear people's hidden stories. And I want to let you know that every single thing that I've learned from these panelists over the past few years is now on the internet. If you run a search on domestic abuse, you will have websites popping up from Australia through New Zealand, all the way up the States, Canada, all around the UK, and they all say the same thing. They all say it is not a person's fault if they are being or if they have been abused. The websites will give advice, they'll give strategies, they'll give all sorts of information. So I'm going to end now with the words of one of the survivors that was in our audience significantly on the 25th of November. And she said to us that you must never underestimate the value to an abused woman of having someone listen sympathetically to her story. Thank you for listening.